Hey everybody, welcome to the multi-game My Thoughts On video, where I take a look at a bunch of different games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I bundle them all into one video. In this particular case, we're not going to be bundling things together based on their genre or anything like that. As you can see by the title of this video, this is going to be themed around No Good Times for Old DW. Now, of course, some of you will probably say, but DW, you hate everything anyway, you don't think any games are good, blah blah blah. Well, obviously those of you who've watched me for a while know that there are plenty of games out there that I do praise. In fact, I've made a few reviews recently that were quite positive, like Control or especially Arthurian Legends. But obviously, those kinds of games are not what this video is going to be about. Now, this video is going to be about games that I went into with a certain degree of enthusiasm, thinking that I would be able to make much more extensive videos about them individually, or maybe even just outright enjoying them, only for that enthusiasm to completely collapse in on itself once I actually started messing around with the game and realized what I was dealing with. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't necessarily mean these games are bad per se. And in fact, if you like the genre that they're in, you might be able to get something out of them. But I just can't be enthusiastic enough about them to finish them and do full reviews on them, or even just continue to stick with them in order to do a more substantial MTO about them individually. So, rather than just leave them stuck in backlog limbo and sitting on my hard drive just taking up space, I decided to go ahead and at least do something on them, so you're getting this multi-game MTO on them instead. So, let's just go ahead and get things started. And we'll go ahead and start things off with Craft the World, along with a bunch of its DLCs, by Decavir Entertainment and published by Black Maple Games. This is described as a unique sandbox strategy game, a mixture of Dungeon Keeper, Terraria, and Dwarf Fortress. Which sounds rather interesting. That's a weird combination of genres, but if it's done well, then it could certainly work. And to be fair, I put a fair amount of time into the game. Apparently, according to Steam, I've put about 25 hours into this game across all of the attempts of playthroughs that I've done. And I say attempts because they usually end up not going very well, for reasons that I will explain more in a moment. For now, let me go ahead and give you an overview of what exactly you do in Craft the World. The idea is that you start with a single dwarf, and you can issue orders to collect resources, to build things, to craft various items, and you will gradually build up your colony over time. And you can either play the sort of default style, which is to start off with basically nothing in terms of tech, only being able to build the most basic of things, and then having to gradually work your way through a tech tree to get to the really good stuff. Or you can go into more of a sandbox mode and customize the settings more or less to your heart's content. Regardless of which one you choose, you start with absolutely nothing built and only a single dwarf, so you need to start ordering your dwarf to go and collect resources like wood and stone and things like that. And as you continue to collect resources and continue to build things, you will eventually get a sort of level up, which will then grant you a few resources as well as an additional dwarf. And as time goes on, as you might expect, leveling up gets slower and slower, and the trickle rate of getting new dwarves is slower and slower along with it. Your first priority, apart from just getting the resources you need to build tools and things like that, is to construct a shelter, and the requirements for this are simply to have an enclosed area that has at least one door leading into it, and to place a totem in that area. Once the requirements are fulfilled, then that totem will activate and that area will become the shelter where dwarves can return to rest and recuperate, because over time they will gradually take more and more damage, whether it be from monsters or just from falling or things like that, and eventually they'll need to return to the shelter to get some rest. You'll also need to keep an eye on their hunger, because over time they will gradually get hungry and you'll need to make sure they have food available. And the idea is that as you continue to dig deeper into the ground, you will gradually find more and more impressive resources. You'll start off finding things like iron and coal, and then you'll eventually get things like silver and gold, and of course mithril eventually as well. This will also result in you finding increasingly dangerous monsters to deal with, and for that end you will need to make sure that your dwarves are equipped with a good amount of weapons and armor, which, unless there is an event going on for a particular holiday season, you're gonna have to construct pretty much all of that yourself. Occasionally enemies will drop weapons and armor that you can use as well, but it's usually pretty low grade, and while it'll get the job done for some of the weaker enemies that you're going up against, once you start going after some of the tougher enemies, and especially the boss monsters and such, they just aren't going to cut it. You're going to need some of the really good equipment. Depending on the biome you're in, this may be more or less difficult to obtain because you may or may not have access to the resources that you really need to be able to build the things that you're wanting to build, especially early on if you have the tech tree going. To that end, you may need to go to the store that's situated somewhere on the map and spend some of the gold coins you've been gradually earning as you play the game in order to get the resources that you need or certain special items that you might be wanting. That, of course, necessitates you actually getting the gold coins, though, which is a bit easier said than done, especially early on when you're not really doing all that much that will get you the coins in the first place. So depending on the situation you're in, you may end up having to abandon a colony almost immediately because you just don't have the resources you need to get initial production up and running. Thankfully, that was an issue I mostly only encountered when I first started messing around with the game, and it seems like they fixed it with patches, so it's hard to say whether or not you'll run into that issue anymore, but it is an issue I was running into when I first started messing around with Craft the World, so I did want to mention it. Something else I wanted to mention is that even though the game does give you some spells that you can use, because in some degree it's technically sort of a god game, but not really, I really didn't mess around with the spells all that much, usually because I didn't feel like they were necessary. Even then, to be able to cast a spell in the first place, you first need the requisite amount of mana specified for that particular spell, mana of course being a resource that gradually replenishes over time, so you don't really need to worry about it too much, but if you really need a lot of mana in a pinch, you can also use a mana potion to replenish it. But even if you've got the requisite amount of mana, you also need to craft an item that will allow you to cast the spell in the first place. And what I found is that usually by the time I had the resources available to craft those items, my dwarves were already equipped with pretty decent gear, and I usually had enough of them to where I really didn't need to worry about casting any of those spells. So while the spells are certainly a cool idea, they're something of an afterthought in practice. Everything else, though, is fairly well integrated. It's just that the game has a bunch of issues that gradually add up to a pretty frustrating experience. The first of these is the interface, which is fairly clunky. There's really no way of getting around it. Trying to build things on certain tiles can be a real pain. Trying to order your dwarves to do more specific things than just giving the job in general, and then hoping that they pick it up eventually, is also a pretty clunky affair. And if you decide to try to take control of one of your dwarves directly, then the controls for that just end up not being very intuitive, and there's not a whole lot you can do with it. And it certainly doesn't help that there's not really any automation of tasks. You can't just set a certain threshold of items to continually replenish over time, and you can't set your food to auto-replenish. So while you can certainly have a bunch of food in stock, dwarves will only know that food is available if it is placed on a table, and to do that, you have to go into the inventory system, which is clunky in general as well, find the food items, drag them into the quick bar, close the inventory, select the item in the quick bar, and then find a table that you've placed somewhere in your shelter, and just keep clicking that until you've placed enough of the food items that you feel satisfied. You have to place each and every single one of those food items individually, and while that's annoying enough, it's even more annoying when your dwarves say, "Oh no, I can't eat any more of this stuff," because they eventually get tired of eating the same thing over and over, so you need to make sure they have a variety of food available, and thus you're going to have to keep going back into your inventory and selecting multiple things in the quick bar and going back and placing them all on the tables, and that just gets very tedious after a while. In addition to all of this, because you have very limited direct control over your dwarves, you more or less have to rely on them automatically picking up tasks and then going and doing them, but you have no real way of prioritizing any of those tasks, so you need to just hope that the dwarves do things in a certain order, and if they just don't get around to it until it's too late, well, too bad, I guess. Quite literally, the only task that actually takes priority over anything else in the game is when you select something to be attacked. Then all of your dwarves will just drop whatever they're doing and immediately charge to go attack that thing. It's weird, but at least they recognize the urgency of when you designate something to be attacked, so there is that. But by far the most frustrating thing about the game, and what ultimately ends up ruining it, is the dwarf AI. they are extremely dumb. They will certainly go and do certain tasks, but again, they don't have any way of prioritizing them, so more often than not, they will not do what you really want them to do. But even aside from that, a lot of times they won't really keep up with their needs all that well, so you might have dwarves just falling unconscious out of nowhere and not really being able to do anything about it. You might have dwarves that'll just get stuck on things in the environment for no discernible reason. You'll have dwarves that just blunder right into enemies and just get clobbered by them. You'll have dwarves that are trying to do various tasks, but apparently don't have any way of getting to the thing that they're trying to complete, so you need to construct a bunch of stuff around that, and hope that's enough for them to actually do the job, then go back and destroy all of those things you constructed around it, so it doesn't clutter up the area. And at this point, I've actually lost count of the number of times I've had to restart colonies in this game just because the dwarves end up blundering into things too much, and they just can't defend themselves anymore when enemy waves come in. And that's not even playing on one of the harder difficulty settings, that's just on the normal setting. I ended up turning this thing down to the very easy setting just to see what I could actually accomplish in more of a sandbox context, and then the game was just way too easy because then nothing posed a challenge, so I bumped it up to easy and I ran into pretty much the same problem I ran into on normal. It was really weird. It's not even that the game's especially difficult, because it really isn't. It's just that the dwarves are really dumb, and if they end up doing enough dumb things, then you can't compensate for it. And that all becomes incredibly frustrating. Also frustrating when you first start out the game, if you only have the base game, is that you realize very quickly the game actually doesn't have all that much content. So you'll be looking into the DLCs, which mostly just give you some new biomes to mess around with, and one of them gives you heroes, which are very powerful characters that can practically take on entire enemy armies by themselves, so they're very useful to have. But then there's one DLC that I don't really know why they charge for, because honestly it's a bit insulting for what you get. It's called the Sisters in Arms DLC, and as the name implies, it gives you female dwarves, which are functionally identical to male dwarves, it's just that they look different. I think they try to justify it by putting a few extra things into the game, like some pets and a bit of extra equipment, and even though it is a cheap DLC at $3, that's still $3 too much for what you're getting. At least the other DLCs add things like campaign missions and entirely new biomes and things like that. The Sisters in Arms DLC is extremely bare bones and, again, should have really just been a free update. But here's the thing, I got most of the DLCs in a bundle, and even though I have almost all of them except for the newest DLC, Heart of Evil, the game really still doesn't have all that much content to it, at least not all that much meaningful content. And I found out almost immediately that playing this thing in any other context than sandbox mode was just not fun at all, because the tech tree is set up in such a way to where you really can't build much of anything until you've ground out experience in the tech tree by building a bunch of things for a specific tech, which will eventually unlock the next thing in the tech tree once you've maxed out that experience bar, and once you've unlocked that new tech, then you will actually be able to build the things in that particular tech. But some of those things are going to be dependent on some other tech, so you need to grind out that tech too, and it just gets tedious. Not to mention, some of those things will get in the way of you doing even some of the most basic things, like being able to cook food. And if you don't remember what I said before, that's going to be a problem because, again, your dwarves get tired of eating things, so if you're only having access to mixed green salads and pine cones and berries, they're very quickly going to get tired of all of those things, and you'll find that they just won't eat, and then they'll starve, and horrible things will happen, and you're not going to have any fun then. So when you bring all of that together, you end up with something that, when it does work, can be fairly fun, but it's also rather frustrating, and considering there really aren't all that many games quite like this, about the closest things I can think of are stuff like Stone Deep and Hammerting, but even those are very, very different games than this. It just ends up being a bit sad, because this game had tons of potential, and it's just not there. And it's been out for quite a while at this point. It came out back in 2014, so they've had plenty of time to sort out most of these issues, and they just haven't. So I have no idea if this game will ever actually meet its full potential, or if it will take a sequel to do that or what. But suffice to say, in its current state, even with all of its DLCs, I really can't recommend it. Next up, we have Legend of Keepers, which is described as the perfect mix between Dungeon Defender and roguelite. It is developed by Goblin Studio, and it was released out of early access in April of this year. And I have a feeling I went into this game with the wrong expectations. You see, when I hear, oh, you're a dungeon manager, well, that makes me think of games like Dungeon Keeper, or the more recent Dungeons series. So you actually build out your dungeon, you set all the traps, you set the monsters up, and then when adventurers come in to steal your riches and such like that, then you can laugh gleefully as they get massacred by the traps and monsters and such, and go about your merry way. That's not what Legend of Keepers actually is, though. What you're actually doing are selecting the roster of monsters and traps that you are placing in a very linear progression. The heroes will go up to the first encounter, they will deal with that, then they'll move to the next encounter, they'll deal with that, and so on and so forth, until eventually they get to the end of that whole sequence and they fight the final boss, which is one of a few selectable Dungeon Master characters that gradually level up over time as you complete various runs, allowing you to improve their capabilities against the various heroes that they're going to be going up against. And most of the time it is ultimately going to come down to that final boss fight, because the monsters that you'll be placing in the hero's way usually go down extremely quickly, barely doing any damage at all to the heroes themselves. There is some degree of strategy in setting up which monsters you want to put in front of the heroes, because there are resistances that every character has, both hero and monster, that you can exploit if you have the appropriate monsters for it, but that is dependent on you actually having the monsters for it, and even then, your monsters are very weak compared to the heroes, so it doesn't really matter all that much. And while I was hoping more for a Dungeon Keeper style of designing dungeon layouts and all that sort of thing, this really plays out more like a roguelite than anything else. And I know that's more or less what they were going for with it, but when you act like this is supposed to be some sort of dungeon mastering experience, and you're not really mastering the dungeon all that much, you're just reacting to things as they come up in terms of events, and you're doing not much more than putting some roadblocks in front of the heroes until they eventually get to the final boss, and then you beat the crap out of them with the final boss, you're really not feeling like you're actually mastering anything. You feel like you're mitigating RNG at best, and it just ends up getting tedious quite quickly. So, while people who are more into roguelite kind of stuff might be able to get something out of this, I really didn't get much out of it at all, and it was really disappointing. So based on that, I really can't recommend this. Next up, we have Lethis Path of Progress, a city-building game by Triskel Interactive that was released in 2015, and is in a similar vein to the classic Impressions city-building games like Caesar, Pharaoh, and Zeus. By that I mean the system they use for getting resources to various buildings is walkers. You have workers that will walk along the roads that you've built, applying their goods or services, whichever they're carrying, it depends on what particular type of worker they are, to the various buildings along the way. So, for example, a merchant will walk along the roads and be dropping off goods at the various houses, while a mechanic will be walking along and repairing any buildings that they walk past. And you need to be careful with the way you set these things up, because there are various conditions that your buildings will fall prey to if they are missed by these various walkers. For example, if a house becomes haunted and an exorcist never ends up walking past it, eventually the residents are going to leave, because who wants to live in a haunted house? If a mechanic doesn't walk past a building enough, then eventually that building might collapse entirely and you'll have to rebuild it. But on the lower end of the scale, if you have a building that requires a certain level of resources, for example, they might need alcohol, then you need to make sure that they have a steady supply of that, otherwise eventually that house will downgrade into the lower level and you'll need to build that back up again. Of course, this does create situations in which if you build the city in an unoptimal manner, the game will actively punish you for it, so you need to be careful and make sure you're at least minimizing some of your mistakes in that regard. The walker paths are semi-random, meaning that when they get up to an intersection, they get a bit of a chance to turn one way or another, and you can control this somewhat by building roadblocks to make sure that they don't just wander past that particular point. So typically, a well-designed city is going to be built in several very similar-looking blocks. That's not necessarily going to appeal to everybody out there, but I certainly enjoyed the old Impressions city builder games like Caesar, Zeus, and Pharaoh and all that. So why don't I like Lethis? Because it's basically the same kind of game, but obviously without the hassle of trying to get those old Impressions games working properly on a modern system with a modern resolution, and with a steampunk theme. Well, honestly, that steampunk theme really doesn't do all that much for the game. It's not really used in a manner that truly sets it apart from games like, say, Caesar 3 or Pharaoh or Emperor Rise of the Middle Kingdom or Zeus. You will notice if you go back to those older games, they all have distinct elements that really set them apart from one another. And even though they may not necessarily have all of the mechanics of the genre figured out, especially in the case of Caesar 3, which is the earliest of those bunch, they all have way more personality than you'd really expect out of a game of that type. They're just easy to get wrapped up in and just enjoy. And while Lethis is certainly not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, and it certainly gets the mechanics right, it just doesn't really have all that much of a personality of its own. Sure, it's got great visuals, it's got good music, and if you're just looking for another game with the same mechanics as the classic Impressions games, then it will certainly scratch that itch for a while, but since it doesn't really have much personality of its own, it's not gonna stick with you like those classic Impressions games did. And without any truly unique mechanics that truly set it apart from the other Impressions-style city builder games, and with a distinct lack of tooltips to help make things quicker and easier, as well as the annoying problem of constantly having to flatten the visuals to be able to see behind some buildings when you're trying to build things sometimes. It's a game that's basically impossible to recommend to anybody who isn't already a fan of this style of city builder game and just wants something that is mechanically the same but runs on a modern system without much fuss. And it's a real shame too, because with the steampunk theme, you'd think they could do all manner of cool things with it, but instead they just use Steam as a resource and it ends up being an aesthetic thing, and that's pretty much it. So if you're looking to get into that particular style of city builder game, I'd recommend just going back and playing either Caesar 3, or Pharaoh, or Zeus, or Emperor Rise of the Middle Kingdom first, because those all have way more personality than this game does, and it's a lot easier to just jump into those and have fun than it is to jump into Lethis and have fun. Because with Lethis, it really is mostly about the mechanics and not much else. Moving on, we have Regions of Ruin, a game that is described as a 2D pixel side-scrolling RPG with town building. I really describe it more as just an action platformer with some very light RPG elements and some very light town building, but we'll get to that more in a moment. This was made by GameClaw Studio and released in 2018, and I went into the game with the idea that it was going to be at least an interesting experience, because I had messed around with a game called Hinterland a while back, and I did a review on that if you're interested. But while Hinterland really didn't work, it got me thinking about the combination of a role-playing game with town building, and that kind of combination could actually be really cool if it's done well. Thing is, Regions of Ruin really isn't an RPG. It's more of an action platformer with some very, very light RPG elements, so I went into it a bit skeptical about that, but otherwise open to the possibility of it being an interesting combination, much like an RPG with a town building game. And almost immediately I was let down by this. You see, the actual vast majority of this game is the action platforming stuff, and it's really not a very good action platformer. I know some people will be like, but DW, it's an RPG. It's really not an RPG. I'm very tired of people thinking that RPGs are literally anything with a stat system, because that's all the RPG-ish stuff you've got going on in Regions of Ruin. Really, the moment-to-moment gameplay is moving very slowly on the map and using a dash mechanic to move slightly more quickly or to dodge attacks, and you'll also have a shield that you can bring up, and you can do light and heavy attacks. Heavy attacks obviously breaking through enemy guards. They also implemented a very rudimentary stealth system where you can go into stealth mode and try to sneak up on enemies, and if you do manage to get a sneak attack on an enemy, it will do a lot of damage, But more often than not, when you go to encounter the enemies, they are set up in such a way to where you really can't be stealthy, and you just kind of have to run in swinging your axe or whatever you're using wildly at them. Eventually, you will gain access to mercenary characters that you can hire to go along with you, and they will also attack enemies along with you, but they will also ruin the stealth mechanics by just blundering into everything and attacking even ahead of you. Honestly though, as wimpy as the stealth system is in this game, them blundering into things ahead of you and just massacring everything in front of you is really not that big of a deal, so it's a bit of a mixed bag there. Anyway, the vast majority of your time is going to be spent in this action platforming stuff, where you're going to be wandering around fighting enemies and gathering resources by smashing things or completing various quests or things like that. And once you've cleared out an area, then you can move on to the next area and continue the process. You're having to gradually explore the overworld map, and as you continue to explore, you'll encounter tougher and tougher enemies, and you will also gather more and more resources, which will eventually allow you to build up the town, although the town really doesn't have all that much of an effect on your actual gameplay. It'll give you a place where you can sell your loot and go and get healed up by the healer, as well as repair your items and equipment if you have access to the blacksmith. And once you have access to the tavern, then you can start recruiting the mercenaries. But most of the buildings take quite a lot of resources to build, and some of which you won't even really have access to at the beginning, so that can be kind of frustrating to deal with. And then the further you get into the game, the more the repetition sets in, because there's really nothing to it beyond wandering around, smacking things upside the head, and then going back to town and occasionally building a building if you happen to have enough resources for it. You always feel woefully under-equipped because all of the equipment that you'll actually find while you're out adventuring is really low-level gear that is practically useless, and when you go and try to buy things at the blacksmith or whatever, you find that the prices are way beyond anything that you actually have, at least early on in the game anyway. And thus, the grind will set in, and if you're like me and you absolutely hate grinding in just about any game ever, then you will very quickly lose interest in Regions of Ruin. And that's a real shame, because the concept of combining a town-building game with some sort of action game or role-playing game or whatever is interesting, and I would really love to see that kind of thing work, but let's face it, there's a reason that very few games have even attempted it. It is a very difficult thing to pull off completely, and Regions of Ruin just doesn't really do that. That's not to say it's an outright bad game necessarily, but it's a very repetitive one, and if you're not able to put up with that, then you're probably not going to be able to get much out of it. And last for this particular video, but certainly not least, we have Slasher's Keep, a dungeon crawler by Damien Schlaughter that was released in 2020, and which has a fair few cool things going for it. The first of which being the most obvious thing, the cel-shaded art style, which is very well done. In addition, the game doesn't take itself especially seriously, and one of the really silly things you can do is use your inventory sack to smack enemies around like you're kicking them in Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. And as you might expect, being able to smack enemies around like that, you can smack them into spike walls or traps, as well as knock them off of ledges and watch them fall into the abyss. Thing is, that's about the extent of what I can actually praise in Slasher's Keep, compared to the amount of stuff in the game that is rather meh or just outright irritating. For example, the dungeons are all procedurally generated, meaning that you're going to end up with a lot of areas that look and feel exactly the same as one another. You're also going to be at the mercy of the RNG, both for the level design itself with all the procedural generation, and for all of the loot you'll be finding, which is especially annoying when you are desperately in need of some sort of healing implement or new equipment that will actually allow you to fight the enemies that you're running up against on even footing, because as it turns out, the further you go into the game, the tougher the enemies get and the higher damage output you're going to need. So you obviously need better equipment the further you go into the game, and it doesn't always give you better equipment than what you currently have. So that can certainly be quite frustrating. Aside from that, you do get 2 playable characters at the beginning, and you can unlock more as you progress through the game, and they all have their own storylines, which don't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things, and more importantly, they all have their own special stats to contend with. And what's probably going to make or break this game for you is the fact that this game is a roguelite, meaning that it is expected of you that you will venture into the dungeon and you will end up dying at some point and have to start all over again. So they give you some sort of persistence where you can gradually improve your character over time, and even though you do lose all of your items on death and you will lose a portion of your stats and XP and such, you'll gradually gain access to permanent skills and such, which will persist across deaths, and even if you do end up dying, you'll still end up with net higher levels over the course of the game, regardless of how many times you end up dying and having to restart. The problem with all of this is that the game is extremely repetitive by design. By it being a roguelite and by it having procedurally generated dungeons, you'll just end up doing the same things over and over again without a whole lot of variance, and while enemies will certainly get tougher as you progress through the game, and you'll start running into enemies that have more powerful abilities, and you'll also run into boss fights, the repetition combined with the game's reliance on RNG will gradually wear on you, and unless you're a big fan of roguelikes or roguelites, then you're probably not going to be able to put up with all of that long enough to finish the game with a single character, let alone unlock additional ones. And ultimately, this being a roguelite was what broke the experience for me, because I started off thinking that it was a pretty neat dungeon crawler, and then the further I got in, the more I noticed things that were starting to repeat, and starting to become very tedious to deal with, and that enthusiasm very quickly turned into, oh, here we go again. I mean, I can certainly put up with the fairly slow-paced combat or the occasional technical issue the game has, but I really don't get much of anything out of roguelites or roguelikes, and the idea of having to constantly start over from the very beginning really does not appeal to me at all. Obviously, your mileage may vary, and there were certainly moments when I was messing around with Slasher's Keep when it was firing on all cylinders that were actually fairly enjoyable, but the tedium eventually outweighed all the good stuff I was experiencing, and I just decided that it wasn't really worth finishing at that point. Your mileage may vary, of course. If you're more tolerant of roguelite mechanics or you actually like them outright, then you'll probably be able to find something to enjoy here, but if you know that you don't like roguelites and you don't like the idea of having to repeat the game over and over and over again whenever you end up making mistakes or whenever the RNG hates you, then you might want to stay away from Slasher's Keep. And that's about all I have to say for all of these games. Again, they're not necessarily all bad games. In fact, most of them are fairly decent at what they're trying to do. It's just that what they're trying to do didn't really resonate with me all that much, and I ended up not being able to recommend them as a result. Obviously, your individual mileage with all of these games will vary, so if for whatever reason you watch the video and you feel like the game is exactly what you're looking for, then I'll still have links in the video description to where you can pick the games up. Although if you end up not liking them, then, well, don't say I didn't warn you. But now that I've gone over all these games, I'm going to go ahead and get back to work on some of my other projects. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.